Getting towards the end of this week 2 of the season 3, the last season of this expansion, we can now have a good idea of what are the meta specs, the most popular specs, and presumably right now at least the most powerful specs at the beginning of this season. We are going to rank them together with the added fun of going back and laugh at the original predictions for this tier, just in case some of these were laughably wrong compared to how things ended up being in this season. And in order to avoid any awkward and cringe situations where one spec is F tier in Mythic Plus but S tier in the raid, so you have to try to make some kind of awkward average, we are splitting the two. We are splitting the two ratings between the raid and Mythic Plus. So when it comes to tanking, it's pretty simple. When we had our predictions, yes, it was a few weeks ago and before a few rounds of balance tuning, but even then we had the idea that Guardian Druid and Blood DK would have been basically the weakest tanks when it comes to both Mythic Plus and the raid. DK pretty much would have had the one chance at being good, basically, if grips were going to be needed in the raid, which you have seen in Dimensius, for example. But besides that, very low value, and then Guardian Druid was just not really being considered. When it came to the raid, we had the same opinion as Vengeance, which continued to be correct. Vengeance doesn't really have any purpose to play in the raid, whereas in Mythic Plus they do have this very high value at the moment, even though we have seen it shrinking a bit by bit, more and more, for 3 of the other tanks right now: Prot Paladin and Prot Warrior and Brewmaster Monk, which are all right now this trio very valuable in Mythic Plus. In our prediction, we did have Brewmaster and Prot and Vengeance very likely to be popular before the release of the season. Prot Paladin wasn't here, although since then they have received a pretty good defensive buff. Doubling the value of the Absorb Shield of their Lightsmith hero talent has been quite nice for the spec in Mythic Plus. In the raid, Prot Paladin was also going to be quite valuable alongside Prot Warrior and alongside Brewmaster, simply because, mostly as we mentioned, raid buffs. Not just some of the things they can bring, like the tankiness, being able to survive steadily, especially Brewmaster, as well as cheesing with things like immunities, like Prot Paladin, but also because Ret wasn't powerful, Holy Paladin wasn't powerful. Very likely you were gonna run a Prot Paladin for the buff, for the Devotion Aura, possibly even Prot Warrior, getting rid of the DPS warriors, which weren't looking like doing too well, so they also had that added advantage. Now, for healers in Mythic Plus, our prediction was also similarly correct. We already basically cut from the possibility healers like Holy Priest, as well as Preservation Evoker, and as well as Holy Paladin not really having much of a chance. And we put Resto Druid as the S tier, the very high value spec, together with Discipline Priest. Resto Shaman was right below them in terms of power, and Mistweaver was alongside Holy Paladin as a very low value spec in Mythic Plus. At the moment, we have actually seen the reverse. We have seen Resto Shaman being even higher in Mythic Plus than these two specs, but I'm pretty sure I have been saying this for a couple of weeks. When we will revisit this, maybe a week from now, a couple of weeks from now, these two specs, or at least one of these two specs, will go higher than Resto Shaman in Mythic Plus. Now, back to the raid. It wasn't nearly the same because Holy Priest wasn't seen as being quite low in the raid. We have put them quite higher up in terms of value. We had them actually in S tier alongside Preservation and alongside Mistweaver. We had Discipline lower down because of the duality with Prez. Whichever one of the two is strongest is much more likely to be played. Then you had Resto Shaman and Resto Druid in the middle, with Holy Paladin below them. Now, the race to world first hasn't changed this too much. Yes, you have seen in the race to world first, for example, monks being essentially benched for playing things like Resto Druid or playing things like Resto Shamans, but that doesn't actually change their power level. If we go to how specs are actually healing right now, Monk is still here. Holy Priest is still here, right? They're still good, and they are gapping by a reasonable amount. How much is this? How much is this gap? If you look at the average HPS, it's a bit still. So it's not that just because you saw them in the race to world first and suddenly they gain massively more value. We can say though perhaps based on the current value, especially the double stacking of preservations, to put the two other healers here over preservation being the only one at the top. And even back when we made these predictions, we were laughing, pointing out that the 3 specs we put at the top in the raid were also coincidentally the 3 specs we put at the bottom in Mythic Plus, and the 3 specs we put at the top of Mythic Plus were towards the bottom in the raid. So at least you have some variety when it comes to healers. For the DPS, this was our raid prediction in terms of DPS power level. And this was our, the Mythic Plus prediction. Although this one was a bit older, it was before the nerfs to marksmanship. It was right during the nerf to Balance Druid, which is why we put them in the question mark tier, as well as before the buffs to Diabolist, Warlock, as well as the Rogue buffs that they received to their hero talents. A few things have remained consistent when it comes to the raid. After the mega buffs, Elemental Shaman has been a stable S tier spec. We also had Destro Warlock, which we put in S tier, remaining S tier Demolock, perhaps less to their fault and more to the fault of the AI of their pets, is not nearly as powerful as Destro right now. We also had Arcane Mage very high up next to Frost. Back then we were saying, but look at the Sims. The Sims are saying Frost Mage is super high. Arcane is, 4% behind. But Arcane has the burst window, Arcane is more usable compared to Frost, which has a very flat damage profile. And right now we do see Arcane here and Frost Mage here, as well as the popularity shows us Arcane here and Frost Mage here. So definitely overall we have the overtaking of Arcane from Frost, and we can even dunk Frost down an extra tier. So the prediction of the prediction ended up being correct. The prediction of Frost Mage doing more damage than Arcane, but then Arcane simply having a better damage profile anyways, turned out to be true in the raid. We also had in our prediction both of the DKs quite high up, and right now in the raid, both of the DKs have been doing pretty well. We also had Fury Warrior quite high up, as well as Shadow Priest quite high up in our raid prediction. We have Frost DK at the moment is more or less the strongest melee DPS you can have. It's not that Anoli is that much worse. Shadow Priest also has been doing well. Fury Warrior also has been doing the second best essentially melee DPS right now in the raid. Now talking about surprises positively, Enhancement after the buffs, back then we put them at the absolute bottom, just like Arms before the buffs, because just because you look at their damage and they had one of the lowest damage in single target alongside Ret and Arms. So how can you expect them to realistically do well in the raid? Well, after the buffs, both Arms, but also Ret and also Enhancement are now in a much more middling to average range. They're not as terrible as they were before they were buffed. And then we can stop and take a break to go back to Mythic Plus, because we haven't touched the DPS yet. And in Mythic Plus, Frost DK has a pretty nice life right now. They are S tier in the raid, and they are also the most played spec in Mythic Plus, alongside Arcane Mage at the moment. This was a similar prediction to what we had in the Mythic Plus meta comp back then. To be fair, we didn't even put Arcane, we just put all mages because we knew just mages in general were going to be the meta pick. Although right now players have a pretty good idea of which mage they want in the high keys of Mythic Plus, and that mage is Arcane. It's not, obviously not Fire and not nearly as much Frost, it's definitely Arcane. So Arcane is here, Frost is still quite decently usable, Fire not really at all. We could be saying the same when it comes to the melee, Frost and Unholy. True, this is a bit misleading because you see Unholy being completely gapped by Frost, so you're like, oh well, Unholy must be terrible. Well, not really. I'm pretty sure that if all the top DKs switched from Frost to Unholy, Unholy would have a much better performance right now, but this is the point of the ranking being meta, and this is not meta right now. A couple of the bets were successful. We pointed out Havoc was perhaps worth betting on in our prediction. It definitely is right now. In terms of popularity, in terms of play rate, actually, at this very moment, Havoc is even here, right? At this moment, Havoc is literally the second most played spec in terms of melee in high keys. Even if we go in the compositions right now that we checked a few days ago in terms of Mythic Plus group compositions, and we looked at the high level keys, Havoc. You have 4 Havoc specs in the top 5 most popular groups. So at the moment, that's definitely worth of being an S tier spec. Now, there were a bunch of DPS we had no hope for one reason or another, either because they were unpopular or because they have been nerfed to oblivion. In high keys, unlike the Raid, where the buffs had good effect on these specs, not really in Mythic Plus. Ret remains slightly more popular just because Ret in general is more popular, but when it comes to the warriors in Mythic Plus, especially not really. Another spec talking about popularity and talking about power at the moment is Assassination, which in Mythic Plus has been doing quite well. Even in the top level keys, you do see rogues reasonably often, not as often as the Frost DKs, likely not even as often as Havoc Demon Hunters. But you do see, you know, a rogue here and there in terms of picks. Alongside not just Assa, but also Sub at the moment. These rogues aren't just Assassination, they're also Sub quite often as well. It's just that in general, Assassination is just even more popular than Subtlety in terms of high keys. Now, popularity might not always be the same as damage, like for example Feral being very lowly played, but you do still see a reasonable amount of Feral, and more importantly, more Feral druids than balanced druids right now in Mythic Plus, and they are popular enough at the moment. So Feral, for the first time in what feels like forever, is like more played than balance in Mythic Plus. Now, when it comes to Warlocks, Affliction was doing terribly, Destruction and Demo were doing reasonably better than them. The power of Elemental is decent, it's not as big as the Raid one. Right now in Mythic Plus, Elemental is doing okay. Who is not doing okay post nerfs were the Hunters, which went from their position before the release of the season to a quite middling position. Not that many players right now are playing Devastation, not many players are playing Outlaw, especially with Sub and Assassination doing much better than them. Same goes for Windwalker, with a few more Shadow Priest players right now. Shadow is, you know, it's in the same range, you know, of these specs like Elemental or like the Hunters, as well as then the melees. You have Windwalker, and even here, where is the Windwalker? What? There's one guy over here. I'm pretty sure it's the same Moon Rune name. Yeah, it is. It's just one guy at the moment. Now back to the Raid with the remainders of the picks. At the moment, unfortunately, a brutal situation for both of the druids. In fact, for all the druids that are not healers. So, well, I mean, what can you say? At the moment, the druids are doing terribly. And to be fair, at the moment, we also have the Hunters not having too good of a time. Marksmanship is doing somewhat slightly better than the other two, but not by much. So not much to be excited about when it comes to the two Hunters, PM and Survival. Marksmanship is doing like slightly better, but not by much. Augmentation also quite terrible. Devastation, surprisingly, is not doing that well, despite the fact that supposedly Devastation in terms of sims is good. And technically, now that we are talking about it, Feral is also supposed to be good. These two specs are in the top 10. Actually, once you remove the copies, like double Frost DK sim, they are both in the top 10 of supposed DPS power in single target, but then you look at how they're actually doing and it's very poor. Now, to be fair, right now you pretty much only have relevant logs for the first 4 bosses, so you have Plexus Sentinel, but even then, pure single target boss, Devastation is super low. Then you have Lumitar, which is mostly single target, Devastation is at the bottom again. So it's weird right now, the current situation of Dev. Fire, given the popularity of both Arcane and Frost, is just low down. Same goes for Affliction. It's doing, you know, basically next to Fire. Yeah, we shouldn't even put them a tier above. But then you have Windwalker, which is kind of cheesing its way to the middle. Windwalker, if you look at the overall results, is here. So, you know, wow, good results. What's happening is that on a pure single target fight, Windwalker is here. Then you move to Lumitar, which is basically a single target fight. Windwalker is here. Then you have adds. Adds on Soulbinder, Windwalker. Adds on Araz, which last and live less than the adds of Soulbinder. Windwalker is here. Basically, Windwalker turbo cleaves the adds with their Stormert and Fire, their cooldowns every time they spawn or once every other time they spawn, and they do good damage. When it's back to single target, they go low down. And considering in the actually hard bosses, basically the intermission of Nexus King with the adds spawning and maybe P2 of Dimensius, I guess we can keep them here because those two bosses are the tough ones and they do have some AoE where they can be good. Then you have Assassination and Outlaw being quite poor right now in results. They're also being pretty much overshadowed by Sub, which is doing better overall in the raid results so far. And then you have the last two, Sub, which we mentioned is doing better than these two, and Havoc, which is painfully average right now in terms of raid results. So this was what we currently have right now live towards the end of the second week of the season. This is the meta for the raid and the meta for Mythic Plus. We do obviously have some specs hitting the jackpot and remaining there even in a different game activity, like Frost and Arcane stay pretty much here all the same. Specs that still remain somewhat high, like Destro, even in Mythic Plus it's fine. And then you have the opposite, the unfortunate ones, like we mentioned, Fire, Survival, Augmentation. These specs remain towards the bottom, even whether it is a raid or Mythic Plus. Same goes for tanks. A couple of the tanks right now doing definitely more poorly than the others in both activities. This is the current situation in terms of the meta specs in both Mythic Plus and the raid. It's relevant because number one, we got to compare them to what things or how things were before the release of the season, what were the predictions, the supposed expectations of these specs, and also to snapshot this, to save this for the presumably balance tuning that will come soon, right? We have this idea that once the race to World First ends, Blizzard pushes the balance tuning because they won't change specs mid-progression for those guilds, but as soon as the race to World First ends, they might adjust some of these specs. So we might see some changes, maybe even today, because Monday is when Blizzard announces the balance tuning for the next reset. So maybe even today, or if not, Friday before the weekend of this week, essentially, for more balance tuning. But for today, though, on this Monday, approaching the weekly reset of the second week of Season 3, this is what we have to go over. So we're starting our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with this thing out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, we are actually still in August, and there might be the debate on whether or not using long pants. Wow.